The morning the widow was turned away from the almshouse gate, I told myself it was a clerk's error and went back to my ledgers. I have had 40 years to be ashamed of that. A man learns, late, that the small lie he tells to keep the peace inside his own chest is the first stone laid in a wall that other men will build higher until the innocent are buried behind it. I did not build the wall, but I handed up stones for a season, and I knew it, and I looked away. If this account has any use, it is only this: to set beside my cowardice the name of the one man in Harrogate who did not look away. His name was Corwin Ash. He was a king's guard, and in those days that meant a man who stood at a post from the 3rd bell to the 9th, and did not speak, did not turn his head, did not so much as shift his weight when the tourists pressed their faces close to see whether he was carved or living. I had passed him 1,000 times without a thought. You do not think about the pillars of a house until the day one of them holds while the rest come down. I was under clerk of the Queen Isolde Trust. You will not have heard of it, for it was a quiet charity, and its founder was 3 years dead. Queen Isolde, the late Queen, King Alaric's first wife, mother of Crown Prince Rowan and Princess Alara, had built it in the last decade of her life out of her own settlement and a grant of crown lands, and she had built it for the people the court forgets. The widows of soldiers who fell in the border wars, the orphans those soldiers left, and the old campaigners too broken to work. There was the almshouse itself, a long low range of good stone within the outer wall of Harrogate, where 40 pensioners lived. The coin, dispersed quarter by quarter to widows across 3 counties, the granary and the winter dole of bread and fuel, and the small school where the orphans learned their letters and a trade. Isolde had loved it more than the ceremony of her rank. She used to walk the almshouse herself, they said, with no more escort than a single guard, and she knew the old soldiers by name. When she died, the trust did not die with her. That was the whole point of a trust. It was meant to outlive the founder, governed by a charter she had sealed, administered by a comptroller and his clerks, watched over, in theory, by the household. And the man King Alaric appointed comptroller of the Queen Isolde Trust in the 2nd year of his grief was Lord Cassius. I must be careful how I write his name, for I am an old man and the habit of fear is not easily unlearned. Lord Cassius was the son of Queen Consort Morwenna, the king's 2nd wife, whom he married 2 years after Isolde was laid in the vault. Cassius was not the king's son. He was Morwenna's by a first husband long dead, brought to court as a half-grown youth when his mother took the throne beside Alaric, and raised there into a tall, smooth, well-spoken man of 30 who wore his clothes like a portrait, and never once said a true thing when a graceful one would serve. He had no rank of blood in the house of Harrogate. He had instead his mother, and his mother had the king's ear and the king's weariness, and between them they had spent 3 years fitting Cassius into the shape of a great man. The comptrollership of Isolde's trust was one of those fittings. It gave him a household, a seal, an income, and the appearance of virtue, for who administers a charity but a good man? That was how it looked. That was how it was meant to look. I had served the trust under Isolde herself, and then under the old comptroller she appointed, a dry, honest man named Havard who died in the same winter as the Queen. When Cassius came, I stayed, as clerks do, because the ledgers do not care who signs the top of the page and a man must eat. For the first year I saw nothing. Or rather, I saw a great deal and understood none of it, which is a different and more comfortable kind of blindness. The widow at the gate was called Anwen. She had walked 11 miles from a village on the northern road with her dead husband's dischar, token sewn into her collar, because the quarter's coin had not reached her and she had no bread. I was crossing the forecourt with a satchel of writs when the porter turned her away, and I heard her say the thing that lodged in me like a splinter and would not be worked out. She said, "But I am on the roll. My man fell at the Weirford ford. The Queen herself put me on the roll." And the porter, not unkindly, showed her the sheet on his board, and her name was there. Anwen of Dell Cross, widow, paid in full, this quarter and the last, signed and receipted with a mark beside it that was not her mark, because Anwen could not write and had never in her life made that mark. I saw it. I stood 8 feet away with my satchel, and I saw a woman told she had been paid when she had not, over a receipt she had never given, and I felt the floor of the world tilt a little under me. And then I did what I had trained myself to do in that first easy year. I told myself the roll must be right because the roll was always right, that some other Anwen must have collected, that a walk of 11 miles addles the memory of the poor. I gave the porter a half-crown of my own to see her fed and housed for the night, which salved me, and I went to my ledgers, and I wrote nothing down. The guard at the almshouse gate that morning was Corwin Ash. I did not know his name then. I knew only that he stood his post with a rifle at his shoulder and a face like a closed door, and that when the widow Anwen said the Queen herself put me on the roll, his eyes moved. Only his eyes. Everything else in him stayed carved. But his eyes came down from the middle distance and found the porter's board, and rested there. And I remember thinking, in the half-second before I hurried on, that it was the first time I had ever seen the man look at anything at all. I would learn, later, that he had been looking at that board for a month, that he had a habit, in the long dead hours of a post, of reading the roll upside down over the porter's shoulder, because a guard who may not turn his head learns to see everything in the narrow country in front of him, and a board-disciplined mind will count and remember what it sees. I would learn that Corwin Ash already knew the widow Anwen's name before she spoke it, because he had watched her turned away once before in the winter, and had noted the date, and had noted that the board still called her paid. I did not know any of this. I knew only that a man whose whole art was stillness had, for the space of a breath, come alive over a clerk's sheet, and that the sight of it stayed with me down all the corridors of that day and would not let me sleep that night. I want to be honest about the court we lived in, because a reader who has never stood inside such a place will not understand why a whole household watched a good thing be devoured and said nothing. It was not that we were wicked. It was that the shape of the danger was invisible until it was too large to name. Queen Consort Morwenna did not rule by decree, she ruled by weather. To fall out of her favor was not to be punished. Punishment can be appealed, survived. It was to find that your requests were no longer granted, your name passed over, a coldness in the rooms you walked into that you could not say who had put there. Men who displeased her were not dismissed. They were simply, over a season, unmade, reassigned to the far edge of the realm, or pensionied early with thanks, or found to be somehow no longer suited. And Cassius was her son, her one great project, the vessel of every ambition she had for the years when Alaric would be gone, and she would need a champion of her own blood standing high in the house. To touch Cassius was to touch her. Everyone knew it. No one said it. That is how a court protects a thief, not with walls but with weather. So the roll said Anwen was paid, and I said nothing, and the season turned. It was Corwin Ash who came to me first. That is a thing I have never told anyone, and I set it down now because the man deserves to have it known that he did not stumble into the truth. He walked toward it deliberately at the risk of everything he had, while wiser men stood off and warmed their hands. It was perhaps 3 weeks after the widow. I was working late in the muniment room, the small vaulted chamber off the trust's counting house where the ledgers and charters were kept, and I heard the door and looked up expecting a servant with a lamp, and saw instead the tall figure of a guard in the plain gray coat they wore off the ceremonial posts. It took me a moment to place him without the bearskin and the red. Then I knew the face, the closed door of a face, and I confess my first feeling was fear, because a guard coming to a clerk at night off-duty out of uniform meant something irregular, and irregular things were dangerous. He asked if I was Elias Frome. I said I was. He asked, in a low, even voice with no heat in it at all, whether the Queen Isolde Trust kept 2 ledgers of its disbursements, or 1. I have thought about that question many times since. It was so exactly aimed. He did not ask whether the accounts were honest, A question a man can dodge 100 ways. He asked a thing to which there was only a yes or a no, and he asked it as though he already knew the answer and was merely giving me the chance to be the kind of man who said it aloud. I could have lied. I could have said 1 ledger, of course, 1 ledger. What a strange thing to ask, and shown him the fair copy and sent him off, and I would have kept my place and my peace and my cowardice, and 44 old soldiers and God knows how many widows would have gone on being robbed. I did not lie. I would like to say it was courage. It was more that his stillness left no room for the lie to stand in. He waited, and the waiting was so complete, so without threat and without mercy, that the truth came out of me the way water finds the crack in a wall. I said 2. He nodded once as though I had confirmed the hour, and then he said the thing that made me his man from that night to the end. He said, "I don't ask you to do anything against your oath, Master Frome. I ask you to help me not break mine. There's a widow named Anwen who walked 11 miles for bread she was owed and told she'd already had. Somebody signed her name. I mean to know who. If you'd rather I never came here, say so, and I'll go, and I'll find it another road, and no one will hear from me that we spoke." He paused. "But you saw her too. I watched your face. You've been carrying her 3 weeks. I had carried her 3 weeks and told no one, and here was a man I had never spoken to laying my own secret shame on the table between us as gently as a physician setting a broken arm. I sat down because my legs would not hold me, and I told Corwin Ash everything I knew, which in that hour was almost nothing, and everything I feared, which was a great deal. And that was the beginning of it. Let me tell you what the 2 ledgers were, because the whole crime lived in the gap between them. And if you understand the gap, you understand Cassius. And if you understand Cassius, you will understand why what came at the end was not cruelty but justice, though it broke a mother's heart and ended a young man's every hope. The trust took in coin from 3 sources. The yield of the crown lands Isolde had granted it, the interest of a settled capital held in the king's treasury, and certain customs and tolls assigned to it by her charter. That income was fixed and known and hard to touch, for it came in through the treasury's own clerks. The theft was not in the income. The theft was all in the outgo, in what the trust claimed to spend. There was a fair ledger, engrossed in a beautiful clean hand, that recorded the trust's disbursements quarter by quarter, and it was this ledger that the household auditor saw once a year when he came, drank Cassius's wine, glanced at the columns, found them balanced to the penny, signed his certificate, and went away. In that ledger the 44 pensioners were fed and clothed, and their almshouse kept in good repair. The widows across 3 counties received their coin. The granary was filled and the winter dole given. The orphan school was maintained, and every penny of income was accounted for by a penny of virtuous expense. It was a portrait of a charity doing exactly what its founder intended, and it was, from top to bottom, a fiction. Then there was the working book, the day book of what was truly bought and truly paid, and I kept it, because a trust cannot run on lies alone. Someone must know what is really in the granary and what the roofers really cost, or the thing collapses. And in the working book the columns told another story. The pensioners were fed, yes, but thinly, on the cheapest grain, and their almshouse was not repaired. The widow's coin went out, but not to all the widows on the fair roll, for a great number of the names on that roll were of women long dead, or women who had never existed, or women like Anwen who were marked paid and never saw a coin. The gap between the 2 ledgers, between what the trust said it spent on the poor and what it truly spent, was a river of coin, and that river ran, by ways I would spend the next half-year tracing with Corwin Ash, into the hands of Lord Cassius. Ash understood the shape of it before I did, though I was the clerk and he was the soldier. I think it was because he had no stake in not understanding. I had spent a year training myself not to see. He had spent that same year at a post with nothing to do but see, and a mind disciplined to hold what it saw without flinching. He had already, on his own, Notice 3 things that a cleverer and more frightened man would have explained away. The first was the grain. From his post at the almshouse gate he could count the wagons. Grain came in from the granary to feed the pensioners, and the fair ledger recorded a handsome sum spent on it, enough to feed 44 men well. But Ash had counted the wagons for a season, and weighed them with his soldier's eye, and the grain that came through that gate would not have fed half so many half so well. Where the fair ledger showed a feast, the gate showed a famine. Someone was buying grain on paper that never came through the gate. The second was the roof. The fair ledger recorded in the spring a great expense for the re-leading and repair of the almshouse roof, paid to a master builder named Haldane. Ash stood under that roof in every rain of that spring, and watched it leak into buckets the old men set out along the passage. No lead had been laid on that roof in 10 years. There was no Master Haldane at work anywhere in Harrogate. Ash had asked, quietly, in the way a guard can ask a porter or a carter a harmless question, and no one had ever seen the man or his gang. Haldane was a name on a receipt and nothing more, a phantom, paid a fortune to mend a roof that still let in the sky. The third was the seal. And the third was the one that would, in the end, hang the whole business, though neither of us knew it yet. Ash had noticed, again from his post, again in the long watching hours, that Lord Cassius had lately taken to sealing certain documents not with the Comptroller's seal of office, which was his right, but with another seal, older and finer, that he kept in a locked casket and used only in the privacy of his cabinet. Ash had glimpsed it once through a doorway. He did not know whose seal it was. I did. When he described it to me, the device of a heron standing in reeds, crowned, I felt the cold come into my hands, because that was the privy seal of Queen Isolde herself, the seal she had used to sign the very charter that made the trust, and it should not have been in Cassius's casket at all. It should have been broken. That is a thing you may not know, so I will explain it, for the whole ending turns on it. When a great personage dies, their privy seal, the matrix, the carved thing that stamps the wax, is defaced. The custom is old and strict. At the funeral, before the vault is closed, the Chancellor takes the seal matrix and strikes it across with a graver or breaks it in two, so that no living hand can ever again make the dead one's mark. It is done so that no forger can raise the dead to sign a lie. I had stood in the cathedral when Isolde was interred, and I had seen her Chancellor hold up her seal and draw the graver across its face, and I had heard the small hard sound it made, and I had thought it one of the saddest sounds in the world, the closing of a person, the last full stop. Isolde's true seal was defaced and by custom buried with a fragment in the vault. The seal in Cassius's casket, whole and bright and stamping clean-crowned herons into red wax, could not be that seal. It could only be a copy, a new matrix, cut in secret, to raise the dead queen's hand and set it to whatever Cassius pleased. I did not understand that first night what he meant to do with it. Neither did Ash. We understood only the skimming then, the grain, the roof, the phantom Haldane, the dead women on the roll. That was theft, and theft enough to hang a common man, but it was not yet the thing that would end Cassius's royal future, because Cassius was not a common man, and the ordinary theft of the poor's bread, we would learn, was very nearly beneath the notice of the court that shielded him. It would take the seal to bring him down. It would take us the better part of a year, and it would cost more than either of us wished to pay, to learn what the seal was for. But that first night in the muniment room, all I knew was that a guard had come to me in the dark and asked me for the truth, and I had given it, and that in giving it I had crossed a line I could not uncross. I asked him, I remember my voice shaking, what he meant to do. He was a guard. He had no office in the trust, no authority over its accounts, no rank that could compel a lord. He was a man paid to stand still. What could such a man do against the Queen Consort's son? Corwin Ash looked at me for a long moment. Then he said a thing I have carried for 40 years, and will carry into the ground. I can't move him, he said. You're right, I'm a post and a rifle and a coat, but I can be a witness. A witness is the one thing no rank can outrank if he lives to speak and speaks to the right court. So I'll do what a witness does. I'll watch and I'll write nothing my hand could be forced to give up, and I'll keep it all here. He touched his temple, until I have every stone of it, and then I'll carry it to the one door in this kingdom that opens above the Queen Consort's weather. Not to the auditor, not to the household, to the king's Justiciar in a closed hearing on my oath, and I'll lay it down so plainly that not even a mother's love can talk it away. He was quiet a moment. That's a long road, Master Frome, and a dangerous one, and I won't walk it if you tell me to go. But I think you didn't sleep these 3 weeks, for the same reason I didn't. The Queen put that woman on the roll with her own hand. I stood at Isolde's post the last year of her life. I'll not stand at her gate and watch her name used to rob the people she built it for. I did not tell him to go. God forgive me all the rest, at least I did not tell him to go. We began that week, and I will tell it as it happened, tier by tier, because the thing about uncovering a great crime is that it does not come to you whole. It comes in pieces, each one small enough to be explained away, and the work, the real, wearing, dangerous work, is refusing to explain them away, holding each piece in your open hand until you have enough of them to lay together into a shape no honest man can look at and call innocent. The first thing we did was the grain, because the grain could be counted, and Ash trusted what could be counted. He had his post at the almshouse gate 3 mornings in the week. I had the granary accounts. We agreed on a plain, honest method that a court could not fault. For 1 full quarter, he would count and estimate every wagon of grain that passed the gate into the almshouse, marking his tally in his head and setting it down at the end of each week in a cipher of his own devising. Not the true figures, but a code that meant nothing to a searcher's eye. And I would copy from the working book the true weights received, and separately from the fair ledger the sums Cassius claimed to have spent on that grain. 3 columns, what the fair ledger said was bought, what the working book said was received, what Ash's own eyes said came through the gate. If all 3 agreed, we had troubled ourselves over nothing and I could sleep again. They did not agree. They were never once in that whole quarter within a country mile of agreeing. The fair ledger claimed grain enough to feed 44 men on good wheaten bread with a surplus for the winter store. The working book, my own honest record of what truly came into the granary, showed barely half that, and that half the coarsest rye and barley, bought at the cheapest, dear bought only on paper. And Ash's gate count showed less even than the working book, because some of what the working book received was quietly carted out again by night to be sold in the town, a smaller theft riding atop the larger one, done by the granary steward on his own account, which we noted and set aside, for we were not hunting small men. The gap between the top column and the bottom was the measure of the lie. Quarter upon quarter, the trust bought a feast and served a famine, and the difference, hundreds of marks a year on grain alone, went out of the accounts as though eaten by an army that did not exist. I remember the night we first laid the 3 columns side by side, by a single shielded lamp. When I had ruled the last line, Ash looked at the sheet a long time without speaking. I saw his jaw set and saw him breathe once slowly, the way a man breathes who has just seen the size of the thing he has taken up. Then he told me to burn it. I protested. It was our proof. It had cost us a quarter. He said patiently that a sheet of paper in a clerk's hand was not proof. It was a rope, and the only neck it fit was mine. The proof isn't the paper, Master Frome. It's that you saw it and I saw it, and we can both stand in a court and say what we saw, and point them to the books still under Cassius's own hand, to be seized when the hour comes. Paper you keep is paper they find. Truth you carry they can't. So I burned it, and it was the hardest thing I had yet done, to put a match to the only honest page in that rotten office. But he was right, in the plain hard way of a man who has decided he will die if he must, and has stopped being afraid of the small things. The roof was next, and the roof gave us the phantom, and the phantom gave us our first true fright. The fair ledger's great spring expense, the re-leading of the almshouse roof, paid to Master Haldane, builder, was a round and confident sum, the kind of figure a man writes when he is sure no one will ever question it. I found the warrant of payment in the file, an order to the treasury clerks to pay the said sum to the said Haldane, signed by Cassius as Comptroller, with a receipt appended in a good bold hand, received in full for work done, Haldane. Everything in order, everything on paper exactly as it should be, and under the same sky, the same real roof. 44 old men set out their buckets when it rained. Ash set himself to find Haldane. It had to be done without a ripple, for the moment anyone in Cassius's household understood that a guard was asking after a builder, the weather would turn. So he did it the way water finds a crack. Guard at a gate talks to carters, to the town masons come to bid on real work, to the almshouse porter, to the old pensioners themselves who had lived in Harrogate 50 years and knew every tradesman who had ever laid a stone within its walls. He asked no direct question. He let the name fall once into a dozen idle conversations. A Master Haldane did the roof, they say, and listened to what came back. What came back was nothing. No mason had heard of him. No guild roll carried him. No inn had housed his gang. In a town where every builder knew every other and fought over every contract, a man had been paid a great fortune to lead a great roof, and no living soul had seen him do it or seen his face or knew where he drank. Haldane did not exist. He was a pen stroke, a receipt, a hole in the treasury dug in the shape of a builder, and the coin that fell into it fell, we would prove, straight through into the purse of the man who had invented him. But proving where the coin went was harder than proving the builder was heir, and it was in that proving that we nearly came to grief the first time. For the warrant paid Haldane through a factor, a money agent named Cordry, who kept a counting house in the town and served a dozen noble households, moving coin and paper for them so that a lord need never be seen handling money himself. Cordry received the treasury's payment for Haldane, and we suspected, passed it on, less his fee to Cassius. To prove that, we needed to see Cordry's own book, and Cordry's book was in Cordry's counting house, and Cordry was no fool and no friend. I will not pretend Corwin Ash did anything dishonest, because he did not, and it mattered to him more than his life that he did not. He did not break into the counting house. He did not steal the book. What he did was slower and cleverer and lawful, and it is the reason his testimony could not in the end be broken. He found the one honest man in Cordry's house, a young under-clerk not unlike myself, a lad named Perrin, ill-paid and uneasy, who had begun to suspect that his master's business was not clean, and he did to Perrin what he had done to me. He did not ask him to steal. He asked him only whether, if a lawful court one day sent for Cordry's books, the entries for Haldane would show the coin going out again the same day it came in, and to whom. And Perrin, frightened and honest, said yes. And Ash said, "Then when that day comes you'll be asked and you'll tell the truth and you'll be protected, and until then you'll do nothing and say nothing and change nothing." A witness held in reserve. A stone set aside. The fright came because Cordry was cleverer than Perrin. Within a fortnight of Ash's careful questions in the town, a rumor reached the almshouse porter, and through him, meant to reach Ash, that Lord Cassius's steward had been asking who among the guards had been taking an interest in the trust's affairs out of his place. It was a shot across our bow. It meant that somewhere in the web a thread had twitched and Cassius had felt it. We had been careful but not careful enough. A guard asking after a builder was, after all, a strange thing, and the strangeness had carried. I was sick with fear for 3 days. I was sure we were undone, that Ash would be reassigned before nightfall, that I would be turned off without a character and left to starve. Ash was not afraid. Or if he was, he had so mastered it that it made no difference to what he did, which is the only kind of courage that is any use to anyone. He said the rumor was good news in its way. It tells us he's watching the wrong thing. He thinks the danger is a guard poking at his roof. He doesn't dream the danger is that we've got his method whole. Let him look at the roof. We're past the roof. And he changed nothing and slowed nothing, and by the sheer flat ordinariness of his days, stand the post, count the wagons, say nothing. He let Cassius's suspicion cool for want of anything to feed on. A lesser man would have hidden, and hiding would have confirmed the guilt Cassius was hunting for. Ash simply went on being a post and a rifle and a coat, exactly as he had always been, until the watchers grew bored and looked away. That was the winter of the grain and the roof and the phantom builder. By its end we had, held in 2 men's memories and 1 frightened lad's, the whole shape of an ordinary embezzlement. The double ledger, the famine under the feast, the dead women on the roll, the builder made of air, the factor who washed the coin. It was enough, Ash judged, to lay before an honest court and hang a common thief. It was not enough, not nearly, to bring down Lord Cassius. And here I must explain the thing that took me longest to understand, the thing that made me, for a black week that spring, want to give the whole matter up as hopeless. The court that would try a common thief was the household, the controller of the king's household and his officers, who policed the servants and stewards of the palace, and who would, in the ordinary way, have been exactly the men to hear a charge of theft against the officer of a trust. And the household in those years was Morwenna's whether made into men. Not all of them corrupt, most were merely careful, which in a court is nearly the same thing. But the head of it, the controller of the household, a heavy cautious lord named Belchase, owed his place to the Queen Consort and knew to a nicety which complaints he might act on and which he must lose. A charge against a grain steward he would prosecute with vigor. A charge against Lord Cassius he would receive with grave concern and refer for inquiry, and the inquiry would go into a drawer, and the complainant would find within the month that his own affairs had become somehow irregular, and the drawer would never open again. That was not a guess. That was the known machinery of the place. To take our evidence to the household was to take a lamb to the wolves and ask them to guard it. Ash knew this from the start, which is why he had spoken that first night of a different door, the king's Justiciar, who sat above the household, who answered to the crown and the law and not to the consort's favor. But the Justiciar's court was not a place a guard could simply walk into with a grievance. It heard great matters, crimes touching the crown itself, the king's own suits, treasons and forgeries against the royal dignity. To bring Cassius there, we could not come with the theft of grain and the leaking of a roof, however true. Belchase would say, rightly, that such things were the household's to try, and would take them into his own hand and lose them. To reach the Justiciar's door and have it open, we needed a crime that was not merely theft from the poor but an offense against the crown and the dead queen's own dignity. A crime the household had no right to bury, because it was too high for the household to touch. We needed the seal. And through all that winter, while we counted grain and hunted phantoms, the seal had sat in its casket in Cassius's cabinet, whole and bright and wrong, and we had not known what it was for. We learned in the spring. I learned it, in fact, by an accident of my own office, and I have never decided whether to thank or curse the day. It came about because the Trust's founding charter, the great sealed instrument in which Queen Isolde had set out, in her own hand and under her own seal, what the Trust was and what it must forever do, was due for its septennial recital. This was a dry ceremony of the law. Every 7 years the charter was to be brought out, read aloud before the Comptroller and 2 witnesses, and re-enrolled to keep it living and unquestioned. I was the clerk whose duty it was to fetch the charter from the muniment room, carry it to Cassius's cabinet, and there read it and see it re-enrolled. It was the one occasion on which the great document left its chest, and the one occasion on which I would stand in Cassius's own room with the founding instrument open on his table. I fetched it, and when I laid it open before him, Lord Cassius did a thing that has stayed printed on the inside of my eyes for 40 years. He was gracious, as always. He thanked me, as always, with that warm, empty courtesy that cost him nothing. And then he said that there was a second instrument to be enrolled alongside the charter. A codicil, he called it, a later addition the late Queen had made in the last months of her life, which had lately come to light among her papers, and which the septennial recital was the proper moment to bring into the record. And he took from his casket a folded parchment, and he broke its seal tape, and he laid it open beside the charter. And there at its foot was the crowned heron in red wax, whole and clean and beautiful, the seal of Queen Isolde, stamped upon a document that no one had ever seen. I read it aloud because it was my office, in a room with Cassius and his steward and one bored undersecretary of the household, and my voice, I am glad to say, did not change, though the words went into me like nails. The codicil declared that the late queen, upon mature reflection and in the trust of her heart, did revoke the clause of her charter that fixed the trust's capital forever to the relief of the poor, and did instead constitute her dear and faithful Comptroller, now himself, as residuary warden of the whole endowment, empowered to apply its capital and lands, including the manor of Cold Harbor and the settled principal in the treasury, at his sole discretion for such purposes as he shall judge most conducive to the memory and honor of the foundress. In plain speech, it turned a charity for the poor into a private fortune for its keeper, and dressed the theft in the dead woman's own love. And it was signed and sealed by Queen Isolde some 4 months. I did the sum as I read, and my hand went cold, some 4 months after she was dead and in her vault. I finished reading. I did not fall down. I did not accuse. I had learned that much from Ash. A witness who speaks too soon speaks once and is silenced. I completed the recital. I saw the charter re-enrolled, and I asked, in the driest clerk's voice I could find, whether the codicil too should be enrolled and recited that day, or held for a separate instrument since it so materially altered the charter. It was a clerk's question, a question about procedure, and it saved us, though I did not fully know it then. Cassius, who had expected either ignorant obedience or open protest, got instead a dull point of enrollment practice, and he answered it as such. The codicil, he said, need not be enrolled that day. It would be brought forward in its own season when the king's grief permits, which meant when Morwenna judged the ground ready. And he refolded it and put it back in the casket with the false seal, and thanked me again. And I bowed and carried the charter back to its chest and walked very steadily down the corridor and was sick, quietly, into the basin in the muniment room. That night I told Ash, and I saw, for the only time in all our long work together, something like awe move across his face. Not fear, awe, the awe of a man who has been tracking an animal by its small prints and has suddenly come upon the whole track of the beast and understood at last how large it is. He was quiet a long time. Then he said, "That's it. That's the whole of it. The grain and the roof were never the crime. They were the practice. He's been learning to steal small so that when the day came he could steal everything, and the codicil is everything. He means to take the trust itself, the manor, the capital, the lands, and turn it into his own estate, and do it in the Queen's name so that no man dares question it, because to question it is to say the beloved dead Queen was defrauded, and who wants to be the man who drags Isolde's memory through a court." He looked at me. "And now I understand the seal." He didn't cut a copy of Isolde's seal to skim grain money. He never needed her seal for that. He cut it for this. For one document. The codicil is the reason the seal exists. And the codicil is the reason we can reach the Justiciar, because forging the seal and hand of a dead queen to defraud a royal foundation isn't theft from the household servants. It's forgery against the crown and the royal dignity itself. Belchase can't touch it. It goes above him by law, whether he likes it or no. And then he said the thing that turned the whole matter from a question of coin into a question of a kingdom. And I have thought since that it was the truest thing anyone said in all that year. "Think why he'd risk it," Ash said slowly. "A man doesn't cut a dead queen's seal and forge her hand for money alone. He's rich already, his mother sees to that. He does it because the money is the ladder, not the roof. A man who holds Cold Harbor outright, not as a charity's tenant but as its lord and heir, is a man of substance, who can be created a peer, given a place at the king's council, matched into a high marriage. That's what Morwenna wants and can't quite reach, because Cassius is nobody. No blood, no lands of his own, a consort's son by a dead first husband. The codicil makes him somebody, the queen's chosen heir and warden, a lord in his own right with a seat and a fortune. It gives him a future in this house he can get no other way. Ash's voice went very quiet and very hard. That's what we're standing in front of, Master Frome. Not a thief we could bear. A whole royal future built on a forged seal and the bread of 44 old men, and the day that codicil is enrolled it's built too high to pull down, so it has to come down before. And there's one thing only that can bring it down. Not the grain, not the roof, not your working book. The seal. If we prove the seal on that codicil could not be Isolde's true seal, because her true seal was defaced at her funeral and lies broken in her vault, then the codicil is a forgery, and forgery unmakes everything it touches, and the whole ladder falls. Everything now is the seal. So the game changed. Through the winter we had been tracing a theft. From that spring we were building, stone by careful stone, the proof of a forgery, and racing, though we could not see the clock, against the day Morwenna would judge the king's grief soft enough to bring the codicil into the light. I asked Ash the question that had frightened me since the recital. If we were to prove the seal false, we had to prove the true seal was gone, defaced and buried. And who could swear to that? The defacing had been done years ago at the funeral by Isolde's own Chancellor. Was he even living? Would he remember? Would he speak against the Queen Consort's son on the word of a guard and a clerk? Ash had already thought of it, of course. He had a way of being 3 moves ahead while seeming only to stand still. Her Chancellor was old Lord Marrow, he said. He's living. He's out of the court now, put out of it 3 years since, by the same weather that put Belchase in. He keeps to a small house by the river and sees no one, and they say his mind wanders. But a man whose mind wanders in the present often keeps the past whole and bright, and there is no moment a man forgets less than the moment he broke his dead queen's seal in a cathedral with the whole court watching. If Marrow saw it defaced, Marrow can swear it was defaced, and if the Chancellor who defaced it swears the true seal is broken and buried, then a whole and living seal in Cassius's casket is a forgery on its face, and no lawyer alive can talk it back to life. He nodded slowly, settling it. So there's your next road, Master Frome. Not a ledger this time. A man. We have to reach Lord Marrow before the court does and before Marrow dies, and get from him the plain sworn truth of what he did at Isolde's funeral. Everything hangs on an old man by a river who's forgotten what he had for breakfast. We reached him. But between the deciding and the reaching there fell the worst weeks of the whole affair, the weeks when it all very nearly came apart, and honest men paid for our boldness. And I learned that the price of pulling down a wall is that the stones fall on somebody, and it is not always the guilty man they fall on first. The first stone fell on the factor's clerk, young Perrin. I do not know how Cordry came to suspect him, whether the lad's uneasiness showed, or whether Cassius's steward worked back along the chain from the guard's questions to the one clerk who might have talked. However it came, come it did. One morning Perrin was at his high desk. By evening he was gone, turned off without a character on a charge of carelessness with his master's papers, and put out of his lodging the same night. It was done exactly in the court's way. No accusation that could be answered, only a young man's whole livelihood dissolved between breakfast and supper on a word. Ash found him the next day on the river stairs with a bundle at his feet, 20 years old and ruined, and I watched a thing that told me more about Corwin Ash than all his cleverness had. He did not use the boy, though Perrin, ruined and desperate, was a witness more bound to him than ever. Instead he took him that same hour to a decent widow who let honest rooms, paid a month of his board out of a guard's thin purse, and told him plainly, "You did nothing wrong, and I'll not let this stand when the day comes, and I'll see you have a place after. But I brought this on you by asking my questions, and that's mine to carry, not yours. If you want no more of it, say so, and I'll trouble you no further." Perrin, God bless him, stayed. He said he'd rather be ruined for the truth than kept for a lie, which is a hard, brave thing for a frightened boy to say. But the lesson was cold. Cassius's web could feel us now, and every honest soul we touched was a soul we put at risk. The second stone fell on the granary steward, the small thief who had carted off grain by night on his own account. In the general nervousness after the winter's scare, his petty theft came to light, and instead of being quietly dismissed as such men usually are, he was seized and charged and made an example of with unusual speed and noise. On its face it was justice, but Ash saw the true shape at once. "He's clearing the ground," he said grimly. "He can't find the leak, so he's tidying up, getting rid of the little men who know a little, dressing it as virtue. A controller who punishes a thieving steward looks like an honest master, not a great thief himself. He's building his own defense out of the bodies of the little thieves." Within a month, the trust's lesser servants were a silent, frightened crew, and any thought I had of finding allies among them died. And then the third stone fell, and it fell on Corwin Ash, and for a fortnight I believed we were finished. The order came through the ordinary channels in the ordinary way, with no fingerprints on it at all, which is how I knew it was Morwenna's. Guardsman Ash was to be transferred from his posts at Harrogate to the garrison of a fortress called the Reach, on the far northern march of the kingdom, 300 miles from the capital, a wet gray place where guards were sent to be forgotten. The stated reason was routine rotation of the guard. There was nothing to protest, no injustice to name. It was merely, as such things always were, that a man had become somehow no longer suited to his post and would be better placed elsewhere. But the timing told the truth. Ash was the guard who had taken an interest in the trust's affairs, out of his place. He had cooled the suspicion for a season by his flat ordinariness, but suspicion in that court did not die. It only slept, and now, with Cassius clearing his ground for the codicil, it had been decided to move the one guard whose interest had ever been noted, safely out of the way to the edge of the world. He was to report to the Reach within the fortnight. I remember the despair of it. All our work lived in his memory and mine. The plan lived in his patience and his knowledge of the law's one open door. And now he was to be carried 300 miles off, and I, a middle-aged clerk of no rank, was to be left alone inside Cassius's own house to face the enrollment of the codicil with nothing but a burned sheet's worth of memories, and a witness or two I did not know how to marshal. I went to him in the muniment room that night half mad with it, ready, I am ashamed to say, to urge him to run, to go to the Justiciar at once, half proved, better a broken arrow than none. And Corwin Ash, who was to be exiled to the Reach in 14 days, listened to me rave, and then poured me a cup of the thin wine he kept, and made me drink it, and said the calmest thing I ever heard from any man. "They've made a mistake," he said. "Not us, them. If Cassius were sending me to the Reach to be killed on the road, I'd worry. But he's not, because he doesn't yet know what I know. He thinks I'm a nosy guard who poked at a roof, not a witness who holds the whole forgery. If he knew what I had, I'd not be transferred. I'd be dead in a ditch or ruined like Perrin. The transfer tells me he still thinks the danger small. That's the mistake. He's moved the one man who could hang him 300 miles off and told himself the problem's solved, and now he'll relax and bring the codicil forward, thinking the coast is clear, clearing his own last obstacle out of the road so he can run faster toward the cliff." Ash set down his cup. "And here's the thing he doesn't understand about a witness. You can move one. You can't unmake one. The Justiciar's court can summon any man in the kingdom to give evidence, guard or lord or beggar, and no transfer, no order, no whether of the consorts can keep a summoned man from that court without itself becoming a crime against the crown. So they've not silenced me. They've only moved me. And a moved man who knows where the one open door is can still walk through it. He need only reach it first. He had it all planned before I finished my wine. He would go to the Reach. He would not resist, protest, or do one thing to reveal that the transfer meant anything to him, for the whole art of it was to let Cassius believe the obstacle removed. But before he went, in the 14 days he had, We would do the two things that could not wait and could not be done from 300 miles off. We would reach Lord Marrow by the river and get from him, in some fixed and lasting form, the sworn truth about the defacing of the seal. And Ash would find and instruct the means by which, when he judged the hour ripe, he could set the whole matter before the king's Justiciar, though he stood at the far end of the kingdom. For a charge could be laid by written information, sworn and sealed, praying the court to summon the informant and his witnesses to give their evidence in person. He would lay the charge from the reach. The court would summon him back. And the summons of the king's Justiciar was the one piece of paper in the realm that Morwenna's weather could not blow away. Reaching Marrow was my part, because a guard bound for the reach could not be seen crossing the city to an old lord's house, but a clerk of the trust might plausibly carry papers anywhere. I went on a grey afternoon to the small house by the river where Isolde's old Chancellor lived out his forgotten age, and I was let in by a single elderly servant, and I found Lord Marrow by a low fire, a great ruin of a man, his fine mind gone soft and drifting at the edges as they had said. For the first dreadful quarter hour I thought Ash had been wrong, that there was nothing here to be had. Marrow did not know the day nor the year. He asked me twice who was king. He spoke of his dead wife as though she were in the next room. My heart went down like a stone. And then, remembering what Ash had said, that a wandering mind often keeps the past whole, I stopped asking him about now and asked him about then. I asked him about Queen Isolde. And the fog lifted off the old man like morning off a field. He remembered Isolde whole and bright and entire, her voice, her jokes, the way she signed her name. And when gently I brought him to her funeral and asked whether he had done his last office and defaced her seal, the old man straightened in his chair, his ruined eyes filled, and he told me, in the fixed unshakable detail of a grief worn too deep for age to fill, exactly how he had done it. How the Chancellor takes the seal matrix before the vault is closed. How he had held Isolde's own privy seal, the crowned heron in the reeds, up before the court so all could witness. How he had drawn the graver hard across the face of the die, twice, in a cross, so no impression it made thereafter could ever be clean. How he had heard the small hard sound of it and wept over a broken piece of silver, because it was the truest full stop that could be set to the sentence of her life. And how the defaced matrix had been placed in a leaden casket within her coffin, the coffin closed and the vault sealed 3 years since, and there it lay broken, so that no living hand could ever again make Queen Isolde's mark. I had it. I had the whole of it from the mouth of the one man in the kingdom entitled to swear to it. And Marrow, in one of those clearings that come to such minds, understood enough of why I had asked to be troubled by it. He gripped my wrist with his old strong hand and said, "Why do you ask me this, boy? Her seal is broken. I broke it. No one can raise her. Why do you ask?" And I could not lie to him, that old grieving honest man, so I told him the truth, that someone had raised her, that a whole clean seal was making her mark on a false paper, and that his sworn word was the thing that could break it a second time. And Lord Marrow, whose mind wandered and whose body was failing and who had nothing left in the world to gain or lose, drew himself up out of his chair with a strength I would not have believed, and said, "Then bring me your court, and I will swear it before the king himself. I defaced her seal with my own hand. I will not let a forger make a liar of me and a fool of her." I had him deposed before a lawful notary the next day, his oath taken down and signed and sealed while his mind was clear, so that his testimony would stand whether he lived to the hearing or no. It was as well I did. He did not live to the hearing, but his sworn word did, and it was the graver's edge that we drew at the last across Cassius's forgery. Ash left for the Reach on the 14th day. I watched him go from the almshouse gate where I had first seen his eyes come alive over a widow's name, and he looked, in his traveling coat with his kit on his back, like any soldier sent to any gray posting at the end of the world, a man of no importance going nowhere that mattered. Cassius, I have no doubt, watched him go too from some high window and felt the last stone lifted from his road, and turned back to the pleasant business of becoming a great man. He did not know that the guard on the northern road carried in his head the whole map of the crime, and in his kit a sworn deposition, and in his patience the one plan that could still reach the one open door. He thought he had won. For a black month so did I, and then, from 300 miles away, Corwin Ash laid his charge. The king's justiciar in those years was a man named Lord Aldous Thorne, and the whole hope of justice rested on his being what he was. Thorne was old and dry, had held his office through 2 reigns, and was famous for a single quality. He did not care whose son you were. He had once committed a king's own cousin for a forgery of deeds, and answered the king's displeasure with the remark that the law was the one servant of the crown who could not be dismissed for doing his duty. He was no friend of Morwenna's, nor of anyone's. He was a friend of the record and the oath and the proved fact, and he sat in the one court in the kingdom that stood above the household, and answered only to the king and the ancient law. If there was a door in all Harrowgate that Morwenna's weather could not reach under, it was Thorne's. Corwin Ash had known that from the first night in the muniment room. Everything, the burned sheets, the held witnesses, the careful lawful patience, had been aimed all along at getting a whole and unbreakable case in front of that one dry old man. The charge came to Thorne's court as a written information, sworn and sealed by Guardsman Corwin Ash at the Reach before the garrison's own notary, and carried to the capital by a road Cassius did not watch, because Cassius no longer thought there was anything to watch. It was a model, I was told later by Thorne's own clerk, of what such a document should be. It made no wild accusation, it begged no favor, it merely set out dry and numbered, a series of plain facts. The double ledger, the famine under the feast, the names of dead and non-existent women marked paid upon the roll, the phantom builder Halding and the factor Cordry, and then gravely and precisely, the codicil, the whole clean seal of the late Queen Isolde stamped upon a document dated some 4 months after her interment, and the sworn deposition of her Chancellor, Lord Marrow. That he had with his own hand defaced that seal at her funeral, and seen it buried broken in her vault. It named the offense not as theft. Theft was the household's small business, but as forgery of the seal and hand of a deceased queen to defraud a royal foundation and usurp its endowment, a crime touching the crown and the royal dignity, and therefore, by the plain law, the justiciars alone to try. And it prayed the court to summon the informant and his witnesses to give their evidence in person, in closed session, that the truth might be tried before it could be smothered. Thorne read it, and Thorne, being what he was, did the one thing Morwenna's whole architecture of weather had no answer for. He acted on it, quietly and at once, before a whisper of it could reach the consort's rooms. He did not send to the household for an inquiry. He did not consult the Comptroller Belchase. He issued, under the seal of his court, summonses returnable in secret to himself, to Guardsman Corwin Ash, to be brought back from the Reach with all speed under the court's own escort, so that no order of transfer or whether of favor could keep him from the hearing, to Elias Frome, under clerk of the trust, that was myself, and I confess my hand shook when the court's officer laid the summons in it, to bring with me, under the court's protection, the working book and every honest account in my keeping. To the young man Perrin, to the factor Cordry, who I have no doubt cursed the day he ever washed a coin for Cassius, and to the king himself, not as a witness but as the fount of the justiciar's authority. For a matter touching a dead queen and the honor of his house could not be tried, and could not be sealed without the king's own presence and assent. That, more than anything, was the thing Cassius and his mother had never reckoned on, that the one door that opened above the consort's weather opened, at the last, into a room where the king sat. I will not pretend the days between the summons and the hearing were anything but terror. Once the summonses went out, the secret could not stay perfectly kept, and within a day I felt the weather turn, felt it in the sudden coldness of Cassius's steward, in a message that my own affairs were under review, in the porter's frightened refusal to meet my eye. Cassius knew now that something had reached above him. He did not yet know how much or how whole, but he knew, and a cornered man in a great house is a dangerous animal. I slept those nights under the court's own protection, in a bare room within the Justiciar's precinct, guarded by men who answered to Thorn and no one else, and I was glad of every locked door between me and the palace. Ash came in on the 4th day, brought down the northern road under the court's escort, 300 miles in 4 days of hard riding, and when I saw him I could have wept. The same closed door of a face, the same flat calm, dusty and hollow-eyed from the road, but entirely, unbreakably himself. He looked at me and said only, "You reached Marrow," and I said, "I reached him, and he swore it, and it's taken and sealed, and he is dead these 10 days, but his oath lives." And Corwin Ash closed his eyes for one moment, the only moment of visible feeling I ever saw the man permit himself, and said, "Then we have him. Then it's done, whatever they do to us now. Her seal breaks his forgery. Everything else is only the reading of it out." And I understood that we had passed, somewhere on the road, from the hunting of the crime to the certainty of the reckoning, and that all that remained was to stand in a room and say what was true and let the law do the rest. The hearing was held in the Justiciar's inner chamber, a plain high stone room with a long table and a great crucifix less austerity to it. Nothing gilded, nothing soft. The law's own room, made to remind great men that here their greatness was left at the door. It was closed. No public, no crowd, no rumor permitted, for Thorn understood as well as Ash that a matter touching Isolde's memory tried in the open would become a scandal that swallowed the truth, and he meant the truth to be had clean. At the head of the table sat Lord Aldous Thorn in his black. Beside him, a little apart and a little above, in a plain chair set without ceremony, sat King Alaric. I had not known until I entered that the king would be present and not merely represented, and the sight of him stopped my breath. He was older than his portraits, grayer, worn thin by grief, in a way the coins did not show, and he sat very still, hands folded, and watched the door with the braced look of a man told he is about to hear something he would give a great deal not to hear. For Thorn had put it to him plainly, that his dead first wife's seal had been forged, her charity plundered, and her name used to build a future for his living wife's son. No king could hear such a thing lightly. He had come because he was a just man under all his grief, and because Thorn had given him the choice of a closed room now or an open scandal later, and he had chosen the hard, clean way. He did not look at me. He looked at the door and waited for Cassius. And Cassius came, and he came smiling. That is the thing I remember most sharply of that whole day. That Lord Cassius walked into the law's own room, before the Justiciar and the king his mother's husband, on a charge of forging a dead queen's seal, and he came in smiling, easy, gracious, faintly amused, a tall, well-made man in beautiful clothes who had never in his life been made to answer for anything and could not, even now, quite believe that he would have to begin. His mother had taught him that the world was weather and that he was the sun, and he came into that hard, plain room still believing it, still certain that a few grave words, a wounded look, an appeal to the king's affection and his mother's rank, would make the whole ugly business dissolve as every ugly business had always dissolved before him. He bowed to the king with exactly the right degree of warmth. He inclined his head to Thorn with exactly the right degree of respect. He glanced at me, and at Ash standing plain and gray by the wall, with exactly the right degree of puzzled, pitying surprise, as though he could not imagine what a clerk and a guardsman could have to do with him, and was too well-bred to ask. He had prepared, I do not doubt, 100 graceful answers. He had prepared for a fight of favor and feeling, the only kind of fight he had ever known. He had not prepared for Corwin Ash, because he did not know that a man who stands still for a living is a man who has spent his whole life learning that the truth, laid down plainly and in order and without heat, is the one weapon that no charm can turn and no rank can outrank. He thought he had come to a contest of persons. He had come, though he did not yet know it, to a reckoning of proof. And the man who had gathered that proof, stone by patient stone, through a winter of grain and a spring of phantoms and a summer of exile, was going to lay it down now, in that plain room, one piece at a time, until there was nothing left for Lord Cassius to smile at. Thorn opened it without ceremony. He said that the court sat, by the king's assent, to try an information of forgery and fraud touching the foundation of the late Queen Isolde, that it sat in closed session in the interest of truth and of the late Queen's honor, and that it would hear the evidence plainly and in order, and would draw its conclusions from the proved facts and from nothing else. He said this last looking directly at Cassius, without warmth and without malice, and I saw the first small flicker cross the young lord's face, not fear yet, but the first cold draught of a place where his usual weather did not blow. Then Thorn called the Guardsman Corwin Ash to give his evidence. Ash stepped forward to the foot of the table. He did not stand like a man pleading. He stood like a man at his post, at ease and immovable, and he spoke in the flat, even voice I had come to know, a voice with no heat and no hurry in it, a voice that simply reported what was so. He did not begin with the seal, though the seal was the killing stroke. He began with the grain, and I understood his craft in it. He built the thing from the ground, small and undeniable, so that by the time he reached the great crime the court's mind was already trained to trust his eyes. He told of the widow Anwen turned from the gate over a receipt she had never given. He told of counting the wagons through the almshouse gate for a full quarter, and of the famine those wagons carried under the feast the fair ledger claimed. He described the roof that leaked into buckets while the ledger paid a fortune for its mending, and the builder Halding whom no mason in the town had ever seen, and the factor Cordry through whose hands the phantom's fortune had passed. And at each step he did not ask the court to take his word. He named the book, the warrant, the receipt, the person, all still in existence, all seizable, that would bear him out. It was not a speech. It was a map, drawn by a man who had walked every foot of the ground. Cassius, invited by Thorn to answer, answered as I had known he would, gracefully and from a great height. He was astonished, he said, and grieved, that the honest difficulties of administering a great charity in hard years should be dressed up as crime by a guardsman out of his depth and a clerk with a grievance. Grain spoiled, roofs were mended and leaked again, the poor were never satisfied, a controller could not personally weigh every wagon. As for the widow and the roll, why, if there were errors in so vast a roll, they were the errors of clerks, and here he turned his pleasant, regretful gaze on me, and here, I will not deny it, my stomach turned to water, for he was very good, and for one moment I felt the whole weight of his rank and his charm and his mother's throne bearing down to make me the guilty party after all. He suggested, delicately, that perhaps the errors were mine, that a controller must trust his clerks and could be betrayed by them, that it would be a sad thing if an honest lord were dragged through this room to cover the peculations of an under-clerk. It was masterly. Against a court of favor it would have worked. But Thorn was not a court of favor. He let Cassius finish, and then he said, dry as a stick, that the court would come to the question of who kept which book in due course, and that meanwhile it would hear the clerk. And I was called. I will not set down all my evidence, for it was only the ledger spoken aloud, but I will set down the moment I stopped being afraid, because it was Ash who gave it to me, and he was not even speaking. I stood at the foot of that table with Lord Cassius's beautiful contemptuous patience turned upon me, ready to name me the thief, and I felt myself begin to shrink into the small, frightened clerk I had been for so long, and then I looked once at Corwin Ash by the wall. He was not looking at Cassius. He was looking at me with that closed, calm face, and he gave me the smallest nod, not of encouragement exactly, but of expectation, the look of a man who has decided you are better than your fear and is simply waiting for you to prove him right. And I found I could not disappoint him. So I laid the two ledgers on the table, the fair copy and the working book, side by side, open to the same quarter, and I read the same line from each. What the trust said it spent, and what the trust truly spent in the same hand in the same office for the same grain. And I said quietly that both books were kept in the Comptroller's own house, under the Comptroller's own seal of office, and that I had kept the working book on the Comptroller's own order, and that the fair copy was engrossed by the Comptroller's own secretary, and that a clerk might forge one book against his master, but no clerk alive keeps two books, one against the other, in his master's house, by his master's command, and calls it his own crime. The gap between those two books was not an error. It was a system, and a system in a lord's house is the lord's. Thorn asked Cassius to explain the two books, and there, for the first time, the graceful answers began to fail. He could account for a fair copy. He could not account for why the working book, in every quarter, told a truth the fair copy hid, why the one was always a portrait of virtue, and the other always a record of famine and false names, and why the difference between them, year upon year, was a river of coin that the court's officers had that morning, on Thorn's warrant, traced through the factor Cordry into payments endorsed at last to Lord Cassius's own use. Cordry, brought in grey and sweating and caring now for nothing but his own neck, confirmed it in a dozen sentences. The phantom Halding's fortune, and much beside, washed through his house and paid over less his fee to the Comptroller. Young Perrin, standing straight and pale, confirmed his master's book. And I watched Lord Cassius's smile, which had survived the grain and the roof and even the ledgers, begin at last to set into something fixed and effortful, the smile of a man holding a door shut against a rising sea. But it was all still only theft, large and proven, but theft, the kind of thing a great house has been known to survive with restitution and a quiet retirement. Cassius knew it. I saw him gather himself, saw the calculation move behind his eyes. He would give the court the theft, if he must, throw the coin back, plead the follies of a young administrator, appeal to the king's mercy and his mother's love, and walk out of that room stripped of an office but not of his future. He very nearly did. He had begun, in a lower and humbler voice, to speak of errors bitterly regretted, of restitution freely offered, of throwing himself upon the king's grace, when Thorn, who had let him build the whole soft bridge to safety, said quietly, "And the codicil?" The room went still. Cassius said, with a fair imitation of his old ease, that he did not take the court's meaning. Thorn nodded to his clerk, and the clerk laid upon the table the folded parchment I had read aloud in Cassius's cabinet a season before, seized that morning, under the court's warrant, from the very casket in his cabinet, and opened it. And there at its foot was the crowned heron in the reeds, whole and clean and beautiful, the privy seal of Queen Isolde, stamped upon a document that gave the whole endowment of her trust, the manor of Cold Harbor, the settled capital, the lands, into the hand of her dear and faithful Comptroller, to hold and to use at his sole discretion. And Thorn asked Lord Cassius in the same dry voice to tell the court what that instrument was, and whose seal that was, and by what date it was made. And Corwin Ash was called to answer the last of it, and he did it in perhaps a dozen sentences, and every one of them fell like a stone into a well. He said the instrument was called a codicil to the charter, and that if enrolled it would convert a charity for the poor into the private fortune of its Comptroller. He said the seal upon it was the privy seal of the late Queen Isolde, the crowned heron. He said the document bore a date some 4 months after the day Queen Isolde was laid in her vault. And then he said the thing there was no answer to. He said that the seal upon that codicil could not be Queen Isolde's true seal, because Queen Isolde's true seal had been defaced at her funeral, struck twice across the face with a graver by her own Chancellor before the whole court, and placed broken in a leaden casket within her coffin and buried, and sealed in the vault 3 years since, where it lay still. And he laid before the court the sworn and notarized deposition of that Chancellor, Lord Marrow, taken while his mind was clear, 10 days before his death, in which the old man swore, in fixed and grieving detail, exactly how he had broken it and buried it and why. A true seal, broken and buried 3 years since, cannot make a clean impression on a document dated 1 year later. The seal on the codicil was therefore a forgery, a second matrix, cut in secret to raise a dead queen's hand, and the codicil it sealed was a forgery entire, made to steal the whole endowment of the poor and to build upon that stolen ground the greatness of the man who forged it. "Everything else in this room is theft," Ash said, in the last flat sentence I ever heard him speak in that place, "and theft is a small, ugly thing. But this is forgery of the seal and hand of a dead queen, to rob her charity and usurp her name. And that, my lord, is why we could not bring it to the household, and why we brought it here." There was a silence in that room that I can still hear. And into it, before Cassius could speak, before Thorn could rule, the door of the chamber was flung open, and Queen Consort Morwenna came in. I do not know how she learned the hearing was sitting, or how she reached that guarded door. A queen has her ways, and love and terror will find any road. But she came in like the weather itself made flesh, magnificent and imperious, and she went straight to the king, past Thorn, past all of us, and she began at once to do the only thing she had ever needed to do, to make it dissolve. It was a monstrous mistake, she said. Her son was slandered by servants. The whole business was a plot of jealous underlings against the greatest and gentlest of men. The king would not, could not, permit his own household to be so insulted. She demanded of a king in a court of law that the matter be ended at once and the guardsman and the clerk be dealt with as they deserved. And for one long moment the old weather filled the room, and I felt every instinct in me cringe toward obedience, and I saw even Thorn go still. For a king's wife in a fury is a great force, and it had unmade greater men than any of us in that room. But King Alaric rose from his chair. And when he rose, I saw at last why, under all his grief and all his weariness, he had ruled a kingdom and Isolde had loved him. He was not cruel to her. He did not shout her down. He simply stood, and he was the king, and the weather broke against him and did not move him. He said in a voice terribly quiet, "Madam, this court sits by my assent in my presence, and it will finish. You will hear it finish. I owe that to the woman whose seal is on that table." And then he did the thing that ended it, that ended all of it, Cassius's future and Morwenna's long design and the weather itself. He walked to the table, and he looked down at the codicil, at the clean-crowned heron in the red wax, and his face, which grief had made gray and soft, went hard as the stone of the room. Because he had known that seal. He had seen Isolde use it 100 times. He had, I do not doubt, watched it broken at her funeral with his own tears on his face. And now he saw it whole and bright on a lie that stole from the poor she loved and dressed the theft in her dead hand. And whatever love or weariness or long habit of yielding had made him blind to Morwenna's ambitions for 3 years, it could not survive that. A man may forgive much for peace. He cannot forgive the forging of his dead wife's love. He turned to Cassius, and Lord Cassius at last stopped smiling. He tried once more. I will give him that. He was his mother's son to the end. He said, in a voice from which all the ease had drained, that he had never seen the codicil before that morning, that it must have been placed among the Queen's papers by another hand, that he was as much its victim as anyone. It was a poor thing, and he knew it as he said it, and Thorn did not even trouble to answer it. He only asked the court's officer to confirm from whose casket, in whose cabinet, under whose sole key, the instrument had been seized that morning, and the officer said, "From Lord Cassius's own casket, in Lord Cassius's own cabinet, to which Lord Cassius alone held the key." And Thorn asked whose secretary had engrossed the fair ledger, and by whose warrant the phantom Halding had been paid, and to whose use the factor Cordry had endorsed the coin, and the answer to each was the same name, and the name filled the room until there was no air left in it for a lie to breathe. A man may forge one thing and blame another. He cannot forge the seal and keep it in his own locked casket, and pay the phantom and keep the double books and wash the coin, and be the sole heir the forgery names and still be its victim. The whole architecture of the crime pointed inward to one man like the spokes of a wheel to its hub, and the hub was Cassius, and everyone in that room, his mother not least, knew it. Lord Aldous Thorne gave his judgment sitting, in the same dry voice with which he had opened, and it was the more terrible for having no anger in it. He found the codicil a forgery, a false instrument sealed with a counterfeit of the late Queen's privy seal, made to defraud the foundation of the Queen Isolde Trust and to convert its endowment to the private estate of its Comptroller. He found the forgery, and the long course of theft that had rehearsed it, proved against Lord Cassius by the books in his own keeping, the witnesses of his own house, and the sworn deposition of the Queen's own Chancellor. And because the crime was forgery of the seal and hand of a deceased queen, a crime touching the crown and the royal dignity, he pronounced its consequences not as the household pronounces the fall of a servant, but as the law pronounces the fall of a man who has offended the crown itself. He stripped Lord Cassius of the comptrollership of the trust and of every office, place, and pension he held of the crown or the household, then and there, void from that hour. He declared the forged codicil null, ordered it struck through and burned before the court, and its ashes recorded, so that the false seal that had raised a dead queen was itself unmade, a second defacing to answer the forger's second cutting. He ordered full restitution of every mark stolen from the trust, to be raised from Lord Cassius's own goods and lands to the last penny the court could reach, and the trust refounded under honest wardens answerable directly to the Justiciar, and no longer to any single lord. And then he came to the thing the title of this account has already told you, the thing that was the true end of Cassius, greater to him than the loss of coin or office. The court declared him a man attainted of forgery against the crown, and by that attainder incapable forever of holding any honor, title, seat, or place in the house or the realm. The peerage his mother had built toward, the council seat, the great marriage, the whole shining royal future she had spent 3 years forging out of stolen bread and a counterfeit seal. All of it gone, not delayed, not diminished, but gone, struck out of the possible, closed to him for the term of his life. The manor of Cold Harbor, which was to have been the foundation of his greatness, went back to the poor it had been founded for. And Cassius, who had walked into that room a lord with a future, was ordered to withdraw from the court and the capital, and to keep to a small remaining estate under the eye of the law, a private man of no standing, for the rest of his days. I watched it land on him. I watched the future go out of his face like a light going out of a window. He did not weep or rage. He was too well made for that even then. He only stood very still, at last as still as the guard he had exiled, and understood, I think for the first time in his charmed and graceful life, that there was a court in the world his mother's weather could not reach, and that he had walked into it smiling. Then he bowed to the king, not to Thorne, and he went out, and the door closed behind him, and that was the end of Lord Cassius's royal future, ended not by a sword or a scandal or a mob, but by a guardsman's patience and a dead chancellor's oath, and a seal that could not be raised. Of Morwenna I will say little, for this is not her story and she is not quite its villain, only a mother who loved her son past the edge of honesty and built him a throne of other people's bread. The king did not put her aside. She was still his wife and Queen Consort, but something ended for her in that room too, and everyone who served in Harrogate felt it in the months after. The weather changed. The coldness that had ruled the corridors, the unmaking of men who displeased her, it did not vanish, but it lost its certainty, for it had been proved in the one room that mattered that it had a ceiling, that above the consort's whether there was a door, and behind it a court, and in the court a king who would rise from his chair for the honor of his first wife's memory. It is a strange thing to say of a case tried in secret and never spoken of aloud, but the whole household knew, in the wordless way households know things, that the immovable had been moved, and that it had been moved by a clerk who found his courage and a guard who never lost his. Corwin Ash was not thanked, not publicly, for there was no public to thank him. The hearing was sealed, the record closed. The whole matter kept quiet for the late queen's honor and the living queen's dignity, and no ballad was ever sung of it. This troubled me in the months after, more than it troubled him. I said to him once that it was a hard thing, to have done so great a right and have no man know it. He looked at me with something close to amusement, and said he had not done it to be known. A witness isn't a hero, Master Frome. A hero wants the singing. A witness only wants the truth to reach the one place it can do its work, and then he wants to go back to his post. And that is exactly what he did. His transfer to the Reach was quietly revoked. Thorne saw to that, and to the restoring of young Perrin to an honest place, and to a small pension for me when in time I grew too old for the ledgers. Ash went back to his post at Harrowgate, to the 3rd bell and the 9th, and if you had passed him at the almshouse gate in the years after, you would have seen only what I first saw. A man paid to stand still, carved and silent, of no importance whatever. You would never have guessed that the honest running of the trust, and the fall of a lord, and the honor of a dead queen, had once turned upon what that still man chose to see, and chose not to look away from. The trust was refounded, and it stands yet honest now, under wardens who answer to the law. The manor of Coldharbour houses the orphan school that Cassius meant to make his seat, and the widow Anwen of Del Cross, she who walked 11 miles for the bread she was owed, and was told she had already had it, was found, and her true account made whole, and every quarter after to the end of her life her coin reached her hand, and no false mark was ever set beside her name again. I saw to that one myself. It was the smallest possible piece of the justice of that year, one poor woman's few marks in a case that turned kingdoms, and it is the piece I am proudest of, because it is the piece that was mine. I am an old man now, and Corwin Ash is these many years dead, and the king and both his queens are dust, and the whole court I have written of is gone the way of all courts. But I set this down so that one thing at least should not be lost with them, that the greatest fraud I ever saw was undone not by a great man but by a still one, that the truth, when it is gathered patiently and carried to the one door that opens above the weather, is stronger than rank and charm and a mother's throne together, and that on the day it mattered, the man who was not allowed to move was the only one who did not look away. I handed up stones for a season, to my shame, and then a guardsman gave me back my honor by asking me only to tell what I had seen. If you take one thing from an old clerk's account, take that. There is always a widow at the gate. The only question ever worth asking is whether, when you see her turned away over a mark that is not her own, your eyes, like his, will come down from the middle distance and rest there and refuse to move on.